My name is Kay Sisk, and I, along with Library Board members Sue Smith and Joellen Clardy, will be taking a step back in time to read a novel to you in a serial fashion. In other words, to find out what happens next, you have to come back the next day. The novel we've chosen is Jack London's The Call of the Wild. We are going to read from the Great Illustrated Classics version, sort of like a Reader's Digest condensed books. The full novel is available at the library for checkout in the future. Jack London was born in San Francisco in 1876. He was not formally educated, but he was a great reader. Among his many jobs were shoveling coal and working in a jute mill. He hunted seals in Japan and Siberia. In 1897, when he was just 21, he joined the gold rush in Canada and Alaska, where he learned about sled dogs. These years in the North were the basis of his books, White Fang, The Sea Wolf, and of course, The Call of the Wild. Despite his success, Jack did not live an altogether happy life, and he died at the age of 40. Do keep in mind that a movie such as The Call of the Wild, which just was released, is an interpretation of a novel. So, let us start. Great Illustrated Classics, The Call of the Wild. Chapter 1, Buck is Betrayed. The day that changed Buck's life began like every other day on Judge Miller's California estate. The judge called to him for an early morning walk, patting him briskly. "Morning, Buck. How's my big dog?" the judge asked. For an answer, Buck tossed his large head with his long, healthy gray fur. His size, 140 pounds, came from his father, a St. Bernard. But it was his mother, a Scotch shepherd dog, who had given the long, wolf-like shape to his nose and jaws. Buck and the judge visited the stables and the kennels where smaller dogs eyed Buck enviously. The judge's two sons, wet from a swim in the pool, invited Buck into the water, but Buck preferred a dignified walk with his best friend, the judge. Their final stop was in the garden to see how the late autumn flowers were doing. Here, Manuel, the gardener's helper, smiled to himself when he saw Buck. Only Manuel knew that this proud pet was having his last walk in the warm sun on the Judge Miller's estate. After dinner, Buck lay at the judge's feet in front of the fireplace and watched the flames. The old man talked to him like another person, saying, "Buck, men are mad with gold fever. They're deserting their families and running away north to the Klondike. They're not prepared for the bitter cold up there or the hardships of a half-civilized country. But even now, in 1897, some men will do anything for money." And that same night, Manuel, beset by heavy gambling debts, proved how right the judge was. After the judge went to bed, Manuel called softly to Buck. Buck knew Manuel to be a friend and went to him. With a quick movement, Manuel doubled a rope around Buck's neck. Buck wore an expensive collar with his name and the judge's name on it, but he never felt a coarse rope like this one around his neck before. He looked up at Manuel questioningly, but the man would not meet his gaze. Manuel gave the rope a tug and hurried out to the road that led past the gate of the estate. Buck obeyed the pull on the rope and trotted beside him. There, a car was waiting with its engine running. Manuel did not speak to the driver. He simply opened the back door and tugged Buck into the back seat with him. Buck climbed in willingly. He loved a ride, but this one was over in a few minutes. When Manuel hurried him out of the car, Buck recognized the local train station. A burly man, almost twice the size of Manuel, was waiting in the shadows. "You timed it pretty close," he complained. "Trains due about now." "I had to wait for the old man to go to bed," said Manuel. "Where's my money?" The big man was ready and immediately handed Manuel some money. Then he reached for the rope that held Buck. Buck growled softly, but the man did not retreat at the warning. He quickly seized the rope ends from Manuel and gave them a slight twist. In the middle of another growl, Buck found his breath cut off. Now angry, he tried to spring at the stranger, The man met him halfway, grabbed him by the collar, and easily flipped him onto his back. Then the man tightened the rope. Buck struggled, but felt his strength ebbing when he could not breathe. His eyes glazed and his chest heaved in a desperate need for air. Then Buck slumped down on the station platform, unconscious. He did not hear the train stop or feel himself being lifted aboard. Now a nightmare began for Buck. The big man rode beside him in the baggage car. At Buck's first move toward him, he tightened the rope, and Buck again knew nothing. In a daze, he felt himself being lifted off the train and pushed roughly into a cage. The cage was loaded onto another train, and for 2 days and nights Buck rode. No one fed him or gave him water. Soon he was sick from an inflammation of his parched throat. Buck had always been pampered by the judge, so he was shocked by the cruel treatment he was receiving from the big man. He was not quite unconscious from the rope twisting when he felt the man untying the rope. Buck gathered all his weak forces and bit down cruelly on the hand. The man drew back with a curse and gave Buck a kick in the ribs. A welcome blackness came to Buck along with the pain. Morning, activity, bustling in the baggage car. Buck's cage was thrown carelessly into a car and delivered to the back room of a saloon. Buck lifted his sick head and looked around in amazement. The room was crammed with dogs in cages. All the dogs were large, but Buck was the largest. And in the middle of the room sat Morgan, the man in charge. He was not very tall, but he had wide, strong shoulders. And, most important of all, he had a club. This club in Morgan's big fist began Buck's education for the new world he was entering. Chapter 2, The Rule of the Club. The 4 men who had carried in Buck's cage let it down with a bang. One of them wiped a dirty hand across his forehead. "Here's a red-eyed monster for you, Morgan," he said to the man with the club. Morgan got up from his chair and slowly walked over to Buck's cage. Buck stood up, baring his teeth. The 2 opponents faced each other for the first time. Instant hatred flamed through Buck, strengthening his weakened body. He hurled himself at the unyielding bars of his cage. "Open it up," ordered Morgan, smiling a grim smile that held no amusement. "He's awful mad," answered one man. "Maybe you ought to let him calm down some." As an answer, Morgan seized a hatchet and chopped off the padlock on Buck's cage with one heavy, well-placed blow. "Get out of the way," shouted a man. They scattered to the corners of the room, one man even perching himself on a dog's cage. Buck threw himself against the cage door. It flew open. His leap broken for a second, he regathered his powers and launched himself at Morgan like a rocket. While he was in midair, snarling with his jaws open, Buck received a shock on his back that felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He fell to the ground. He had never been hit by a club before and did not understand what had happened. But in a second he was up and flying at Morgan once more. Again the terrible shock came as Morgan slammed the club across Buck's shoulders. Buck went down again. This time he was aware that it was the club in Morgan's fist that was bringing him down, that there was no way to avoid it. Buck kept springing at Morgan's throat, but each time the club cut him down with a pain that jarred his whole body. Buck never reached Morgan. After a dozen blows, Buck could no longer stand up, much less spring at the man. Then Morgan advanced and, taking careful aim, hit Buck on the nose with full force. All the pain that Buck had endured was nothing compared to the agony of this last blow. It crumpled him completely. And the room, Morgan, the other man, and the dogs faded from his sight into blackness. When Buck's senses returned, he still lay where he had fallen. His collar was now in Morgan's hand, along with the club, and the man was reading his name. Then Morgan spoke in a voice that held no anger. "Now, Buck, you know who is master here. Behave, and there'll be no clubbing." He reached out his left hand and patted Buck on his bleeding head. Buck did not have the strength to bite that hand, even if he had wanted to. Yet, though he hated Morgan, he did not want to bite him. Buck understood that he was now under the rule of the club. The club had beaten him, and it had not broken him. It was a lesson to be learned, Buck reasoned. In this new life, a dog stood no chance against a man with a club. So Buck gladly accepted the water and food that Morgan brought him. And in the next few weeks, he made no move toward Morgan. He simply ate, drank, and recovered his strength as his wounds healed.